I hope most of you were here last night to hear Arthur Dahl's presentation on transforming the environment from the inside out. We're really happy to have him here to give a short response to the two presentations this morning. So I'd like to welcome Arthur up to the stage.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Peter, for an outstanding presentation, which is very difficult to respond in a few minutes because you covered so many critical and key issues. I think it's certainly impressive to see the convergence of thinking between your reflections on these issues from your own spiritual tradition and the way in which the Baha'i community has approached this, and has approached it, in fact, for many years. You cited many recent examples of thinking in this area. In fact, Baha'i involvement in environmental issues goes back, you might say, to the 1920s, which is relatively early in thinking on this topic, when Richard St. Barr Baker, an early Baha'i in Africa, has set up the organization called Men of the Trees, working with the people in Kenya to begin to restore their damaged environment. And then he was sent by the British government to Palestine in the early 1930s to try to get the religions involved in reforesting Palestine. And the first life member of the Men of the Trees was a young man by the name of Shoghi Effendi, which shows that Baha'i commitment goes back a very long time. And Shoghi Effendi encouraged him in his work, his World Forestry Charter gatherings in the 1950s and so on. Then there was another early person in this area, Vincent Brown, a naturalist in California. Among other things, wrote a book called Warriors of the Rainbow, bringing together the Native American and First Nations traditions about the future unification of mankind, which became, you might say, the founding charter for an organization called Greenpeace, which always has had a book called the Rainbow Warriors, derived from this book of Baha'i inspiration, even if we don't always share the methods they use to achieve their goals. The Baha'is have been involved at the United Nations level. I was the representative of the Baha'i community at the Stockholm Conference in 1972, where we were already involved in the issues at that time, trying to find solutions at the global level to these problems. And so there is, might say, a long track record in the Baha'i community in addressing these issues, and we see this very good convergence now with the views that Peter Brown has given us this morning, where we need to recognize that there is both a spiritual and material or scientific challenge to this problem, and the need to find new ways of going forward in thinking about it. With respect to Peter's sort of main headings of areas for action, what is the economy for? There's a very close link between Peter's concept of right relationship and terms in the Baha'i writings and statements about our trusteeship or stewardship for the natural environment and the oneness of humankind as a way of looking at the world that brings all of humanity and all of the creation together in one single integrated system with a commitment to maintaining life of all sorts on this planet, which is where we see, for instance, in the Baha'i statements that I quoted last night about the need to preserve as much as possible of the Earth's biodiversity and natural order, and our fundamental responsibility for our spiritual development and physical survival, both linked to our understanding of the natural world and the environment, and the fact that its value cannot be expressed in economic terms. Abdu'l-Baha, for instance, also referred to the relationships that exist among all created things, and that is cooperation and reciprocity are essential properties which are inherent in the unified systems of the world of existence, and without which the entire creation would be reduced to nothingness. So we are certainly in a wrong relationship with our environment in our present economic system, and that right relationship must recognize this cooperation and reciprocity that we have all across the natural creation as well as human society. We also find in the Baha'i statements the fact that the earnest hope that this moral crisis can somehow be met by deifying nature itself is an evidence of the spiritual and intellectual desperation that the crisis has engendered. Recognition that creation is an organic whole and that humanity has the responsibility to care for this whole, welcome as it is, does not represent an influence which can by itself establish in the consciousness of people a new system of values. Only a breakthrough in understanding that is scientific and spiritual in the fullest sense of the terms will empower the human race to assume the trusteeship towards which history impels it. So we have this very clear charter. We must bring together the scientific and the spiritual in this trusteeship we must respect, this right relationship we must have with our natural environment. And this, of course, is why we must recognize that our focus for development, our focus for the economy of society must change. And I referred a bit last night to the new economic models that we must be creating to replace the failing system that we have, that Peter's referred to this morning, and that we need to create this dynamic, just, and thriving social order, which will be strongly altruistic and cooperative in nature, will provide meaningful employment, and help to eradicate poverty in the world. Because much of the destruction of our environment is being driven, on the one hand, by our overconsumption in the wealthy countries, on the other hand, by the struggle for survival of the poor. And the two must be addressed. The human dimension and the natural dimension must come together in a coordinated view of how we respond to the challenges we're facing. With respect to how big is too big, I think, as Peter said, clearly we have already overshot the planet's limits with our society. And Baha'u'llah warned us that the civilization so vaunted by the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overleap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. If carried to excess, civilization will prove as prolific a source of evil as it had been of goodness when kept within the restraints of moderation. The day is approaching when its flame will devour the cities. And that's why we need the spiritual approach of being content with little and taking from the world only to the measure of our needs as an antidote to our consumer society, which is pushing us to destroy so much of the planet today. So, what is fair in sharing life's bounties? Baha'u'llah talked about the need to eliminate extremes of wealth and poverty as an essential approach to addressing this problem. And he emphasized the spiritual importance of voluntary sharing of one's property. The communist system tried to sort of take things away from the rich and give it to the poor. But this is why a spiritual approach is so necessary, to make this not something imposed from outside, but something that becomes a natural response of each individual, to want to share one's property with others among mankind. Because this is greater than equality. It consists that man should not prefer himself to others, but rather should sacrifice his life and property for others. This should not be introduced by coercion so that it becomes a law and man is compelled to. Rather, man should voluntarily and of his own choice sacrifice his property for others and spend willingly for the poor. It's a quote from Abdu'l-Baha. We also must recognize the importance of justice as that spiritual principle that can translate the dawning consciousness of humanity's oneness into a collective will through which the necessary structures of global community of life can be confidently erected. In an age that sees the peoples of the world increasingly gaining access to information of every kind and to diversity of ideas, we'll find justice asserting itself as the ruling principle of successful social organization. And therefore, we must recognize that we cannot sacrifice the well-being of the generality of humankind, as I quoted last night, even of the planet itself, to the advantages which technological breakthroughs can make available to privileged minorities. Only development programs that are perceived as meeting their needs and as being just and equitable in objective can hope to engage the commitment of the masses of humanity upon which implementation depends. Now, with respect to governance, I think that the Baha'i approach is so convergent, so close to that Peter has explained from his side. Certainly, this issue of the global reserve, the need to scientifically understand what is happening, this is already, you might say, an embryonic form and trying in the United Nations. In fact, I was myself responsible for 10 years for setting up what was called the UN System-Wide Earthwatch to monitor and assess the state of the planet and provide guidance to governments on the directions that should be taken to preserve its integrity. Unfortunately, as he also pointed out, UNEP, the United Nations that I was working for, doesn't have the resources to do this effectively. That was my job. I was one person with a half-time secretary to try to do all of this for the planet, bring together all the world space agencies, the United Scientific Program, so on. What can one person do faced with those kinds of challenges? And this, I think, shows the deficiency of governance at the present time, that we recognize the need, recognize the requirement, but we're not yet willing to put the resources into it to make it happen. And therefore, as one element of governance, embryonically it may exist, but much more is needed to make it work. I think, on the other hand, where it comes to this issue of a global federation, the Baha'i teachings are very clear, they're very deep, and they give a lot of details of what this might look at. And again, it's very close to what Peter was referring to, where we see in the world order of Baha'u'llah, as described by Shoghi Effendi, as the unity of the human race, as envisioned by Baha'u'llah, implies the establishment of a world commonwealth in which all nations, races, creeds, and classes are closely and permanently united, and in which the autonomy of its state members and the personal freedom and initiative of individuals that compose them are definitely and completely safeguarded. So we have the concepts of a world legislature which can manage the world's resources at the planetary level and therefore become trustee of the Earth's commons, as Peter's referred to, a world executive which will have the power to enforce the decisions taken at this level, and a world tribunal, which he also has referred to, a global court, to adjudicate and deliver its compulsory and final verdict in all and any disputes that may arise from the various elements consisting of this universal system. So we have also this concept of subsidiarity, the need to bring responsibility down to the lowest possible level. And we see that in the structure of the Baha'i administration, where responsibility is at the local level, national level, as well as the global level, in a very delicate balance. We also have this same concept, the need to equitably regulate the distribution of all the products of this global system that must be created, the new world economy that must come out on very different principles, as I mentioned last night, from the principles that we see in the present economic system, which is so unbalanced and so unjust in its operation. And then, since we want enough time for discussion this morning, I think we must recognize that these 4 steps to the whole Earth economy that Peter's referred to, clearly the grounding needs a spiritual basis for action. And that's where the Baha'i faith has been trying to provide that spiritual foundation, recognizing that there are elements of that in all the faith traditions. You see it in Buddhism, you see it in elements of Christianity, although clearly it has also been taken in other directions by certain kinds of thinking, whether it's been seen as domination rather than stewardship and trusteeship, and in many other faith communities and many indigenous peoples as well around the world. With respect to the design of that whole economy, I think the Baha'i teachings are clear and quite explicit about the institutions that are needed to achieve that functioning. With respect to the witness, I think where we see in this quotation from the Baha'i community, laying the groundwork for global civilization calls for the creation of laws and institutions that are universal in both character and authority. The effort can begin only when the concept of the oneness of humanity has been wholeheartedly embraced by those in whose hands the responsibility for decision-making rests, and when the related principles are propagated through both educational systems and the media of mass communication. Once this threshold is crossed, a process will have been set in motion through which the peoples of the world can be drawn into the task of formulating common goals and committing themselves to their attainment. So this process of witness, this public change in consciousness, can come about quite quickly once we've achieved that critical mass of awareness among decision makers that this is the direction we must take. Because then we can harness the technologies, the methods in our education systems around the planet and in the mass media to get all the population of the planet involved, all peoples involved, in committing themselves to just and equitable solutions to the environmental problems we face. We may not always agree in the nonviolent reform, certainly nonviolent, but the Baha'i approach is to look at building a positive model to replace the defective models we see in the society around us. And we are working to build alternatives at our communities, through the core activities, in our work with communities outside and external relations, positive models of what the alternative world system can look like so that we can take these steps to a whole earth economy, as Peter has described so well for us this morning. And I think now we can leave more openly for all of you to contribute your ideas, take part in the discussion, so we can see how we can together take this thinking forward in this Association for Baha'i Studies and our work afterwards to try to achieve the kind of world we're all hoping for and working for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur. We got a great number of questions. I think we have over 25 questions. So we won't be able to address them all, but we've tried to choose some themes that came up in a number of them. The first set of questions, Arthur, you touched on in the second set of your remarks. It's about what a fundamental change of consciousness looks like. So this is the first question. And I'll just open it up to all three speakers, and you can decide who'd like to respond. The Baha'i Faith proposes a fundamental and spiritual shift in the values of humanity in order to bring about lasting changes that would be reflected in both governance and individual behavior. What do you think the role of religious institutions might be in helping to change the values of humanity? Somebody else asked, what is a fundamental change of consciousness? Have you had it? What is it? How will it be accomplished? How do we do it? And what are some practical steps we can take to shift the hearts and minds of people to view the earth in a more sustainable and spiritual context? So I'll turn it over to you.
Can I take a stab at that consciousness question? I think we're all evolving on this. Stand up so you can see me. Sorry, we didn't move the podium, we meant to. The issue of consciousness, I think we're coming to it from a couple of different angles. At least I am. And one of the propelling motivators for me has been climate change. I think that climate change has been a wake-up call to many of us about the limitations of life on the planet and our responsibility to each other and to future generations. And so my motivation for change is coming from an awareness of the science as well as an awareness of the faith's teachings about humanity. I'm going to pass it on.
Well, it's a very open question. I'll just try to take a stab at it. Have I had it, part of it? So I don't know if I've had a change of conscience. I've had a sort of expansion, I guess, of the consciousness that's been in me for a long time. I remember when I was about 12 years old, a time I was in the woods in northern Connecticut, having just somehow or other getting a reorientation, to the earth and thinking about it very differently at that time. I was by myself, and I was in a place where there's some young pines, and having a sort of different sense of myself, and beginning then is when I can date the feeling I've had my whole life of being appalled basically at the way this civilization conducts itself. And I took the train from Montreal to Toronto 3 or 4 months ago, and I remember thinking, well, if you looked out at this landscape from an Aldo Leopold point of view, he says that anybody with an ecological conscience lives in a world of wounds, right? And it seems to me that the whole path between the two cities was wounded, right? There was nothing there that hadn't been treated with disrespect, or almost nothing. I suppose there were a few places. So my original response to this was to try to buy enough of America to save itself, to save it from itself. But that proved to be, I think Ted Turner actually tried to do that, but he had a lot more to work with than I did on a professor's salary. It took me about 20 years to figure out that wasn't going to work. And then I started working with the land trust movement and And then I remember there was a sign on Route 50 as you approach the Bay Bridge. I used to live in Washington and Annapolis. It said, "Progress is our project." It was put up by the Department of the DOT of Maryland, MDOT, Maryland Department of Transportation. Well, what they were doing was they were widening Route 50 so you could get to the beach faster, paving over, destroying wetlands, farmland, creating places where shopping centers would spring up near towns and everything. So I realized it was the opposite of progress. It was just a wholesale destruction, and that's when I started to work on economics.
I think with respect to the role of religion, it's an evolving role. When I was at the Stockholm Conference in 1972, representing the Baha'i International Community, we had a meeting among all representatives of different religions there, and all the others were saying, we're trying to get the attention of our hierarchy, our leadership. They don't know about this issue. The Baha'is had sent 2 ecologists to the conference and issued a statement on human values and the environment, and were already actively involved in this area. Then there has been an evolution. There was the Summit on Religions and Conservation in 1995 at Windsor Castle, where Prince Philip invited the ecumenical patriarch from Constantinople and the Archbishop of Canterbury and other significant leaders there. And there was clearly a growing awareness, at least at the top in religions, that this was an important issue to be involved in. Now we will be seeing the launching of action plans on climate change from all the religions in the next few months. So clearly, religion has become aware that it must apply its ethical values in this area, and the structures of all the religions are beginning to mobilize themselves to do that as one of the key ethical challenges of our time, to which all of their principles reply. With respect to changing consciousness, I think this is the kind of thing that everybody goes through individually and never stops going through it. We know, of course, in the Baha'i faith that learning is a lifelong process, that you never stop growing spiritually. I certainly, if you look at my own track record, more than 60 years I've been gradually expanding my awareness and understanding of this, from Baha'i children's classes all the way up through summer schools and on to serving the community and the Baha'i international community in various ways. So I think that all of us have to find our own path in changing our consciousness and suddenly being aware that in fact spirituals can take us in new directions, that we need to always go back to the spiritual dimension and say, am I doing things right in my material life? Have I actually developed a convergence between my spiritual awareness and my daily lifestyle? And that's a challenge each of us, particularly those living in North America, have to go through, to question each thing that we're doing and say, how does this relate to my own growing consciousness of the spiritual responsibilities we all have for the planet?
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, all 3 of you. We have to take just one moment to say that if somebody has a Florida state license plate and their car is parked on the 5th floor, it's about to be towed. So if that's your car, go get it. We had 2 questions about the absence of Indigenous and Aboriginal perspectives in this area. So this question is, when will science and academia allow them their rightful place and recognize their vital part in the stewardship of the earth? And then there's a set of questions about the types of economic changes looming on the horizon. What will investing look like for individuals, and are there avenues of investment that we should look into now? Another question about what does a non-consumerist economy look like? And then a question that asks about the system of capitalism. So the free enterprise system, capitalism, has been a tremendously liberating force over the past 2 centuries. Its failings are largely human and moral, not systemic. The market system is not inherently inconsistent with Baha'i teachings and could be embraced as a powerful tool to solve environmental and other challenges. Can you comment on this?
Well, thank you for the exciting questions. I think with respect to that, Prince, the last comment on the free enterprise, the market system, the mechanisms of the market are reasonable mechanisms if they were applied in a spiritual context. The theory of the market requires perfect information between the buyer and the seller to fix an appropriate price. How often today do you get perfect information? Usually you manipulate the information to get advantages in the market. It's the values underlying the system that are wrong. After all, the Bob was a merchant. He was buying and selling. But when he didn't sell something at the highest price and waited and sold a little bit lower, he felt that justice required that he provide the highest price that the person did it for. His values were different, even though he was working in the market system. So I think that we have recognized that what we need to change are the values. And in fact, the market mechanism would work much better in a spirit of consultation between, looking for the just solution between a buyer and a seller than it would in the present competitive, trying to get an edge over the competition, kind of approach that it takes. So what we need to change is much more the values underlying the way the economy works rather than necessarily the specific mechanisms by which it operates, although it does have other problems in that area. With respect to the absence of indigenous or aboriginal perspectives, clearly this is an area where the Baha'i faith, with its universal membership, including members of many Aboriginal and indigenous groups, is extremely important. I myself spent a decade working in the Pacific Islands with the Pacific Island peoples, helping to ground their approach to the world society in a set of better values than that of the Western system. And in fact, we built a whole educational program on those values and the fact that they were far ahead of the Western economic system in understanding how to deal with issues of sustainability and the environment. I think that where we haven't done enough of this, perhaps we need to listen more to those who are much more developed than we are. We may be developed in the material sense in North America, but we're seriously underdeveloped in a social and spiritual sense. And other so-called indigenous peoples are far ahead of us. We have much to learn from them in their approach to the stewardship of resources. So I think there needs to be certainly a better exchange, recognition that there's a sharing here. It's not developed or developing. We each have things to learn from the other, and it's only when we bring all of that together that we'll be able to find a way forward. And in fact, I mentioned Vincent Brown earlier. He was raised on Dakota Reservation. He was extremely sensitive from many books about the indigenous traditions and did his best to try to bring that dimension into our approach to both the environment and to our approach in the Baha'i faith. So there's a few comments on those very important questions that I think that are fundamental to how we approach this issue.
So there's a lot of questions in there, and I'll just take a couple of them. On the question of indigenous or First Nations peoples, no question in my mind that their insights are essential. We do use those traditions a lot in the book, and we have programs where I teach at McGill that cooperate directly with the Mohawk, or developing one cooperating with the Mohawk community just south of Montreal, and also a program going back 10 years with the Cree in the James Bay region. That's given access of lots of students, and my primary motivation in that is to get students exposed to a non-Western metaphysics and theology. So that's been very successful with that objective. On the question of capitalism, I don't know, that doesn't seem to be practiced anywhere that I've been able to find. There's the greatest theft in human history has just been accomplished on behalf of saving capitalism by impoverishing you and your children. There's definitely good things about a free enterprise system if we had one, which is that it internalizes risk and brings about prudent behavior. So we should, when the future design of a system, we need to keep those goals in mind, but that certainly isn't what we have. On a practical matter, what would a society like this look like? It's a huge question to which I don't have complete answers, but one thing that should be done is to take back the right to print money. The federal government of the United States and most other countries have given this away to their central banks and to the banks and credit card companies. So I believe it's correct that in the United States, only about 2% of the money supply is actually created by the Treasury. The rest is created by the Federal Reserve, which is, by the way, not a Federal Reserve. It's actually a private entity, and by banks and credit card companies. So Arthur was mentioning last night $500 trillion in derivatives. Well, where did the dollars come from that got to denominate all of those fantastic assets or alleged assets? Because they got made up out of nothing, basically. They're just created by banks. So if you go to a bank and you want to borrow, let's say, $100,000 to buy a house, the bank doesn't have to have $100,000. It just has to have the right to create $100,000, and it gets that from the Fed. called fractional reserve banking. A bank has to have a little percentage of what it loans you, but doesn't have to have anything like the whole amount. So if you got rid of fractional reserve banking, for instance, or even diminished it, then if I go to the bank and I want to borrow $100,000 to build a house, Arthur has to have lent the bank $100,000 so that I can use it, right? So in the old days, the bank took somebody's money, paid him or her some interest on it, and then lent the same money to somebody else. Well, that constrained consumption because I can't build, under the present system, Arthur can build a house and I can build a house, but without fractional reserve banking, if he's loaning the money, he doesn't have it. I have the money, and so only one house gets built, right, instead of two houses getting built. So you ratchet down consumption. You also give back to the government what's called seigniorage, right? The right that when the government prints a dollar bill, it doesn't cost $1 to print it. It costs probably a couple cents, maybe or even less. When the government spends that on, let's say, improving highways or mass transit or something, it gets 100 cents of value from the company it buys the subway car from, for instance, right? So the government has earned, in a sense, 98 cents on its dollar. Right? So you get a tremendous source of public revenue, right, just by taking back the right to create money. So that's that kind of reform and kind of rethinking is what we're going to need to get on the right track. But that would be fought tooth and nail by the beneficiaries of the present, basically irresponsible system.
And I just had a couple of thoughts on the indigenous question. Indigenous people, interestingly, are one of 9 major groups that have been identified by the United Nations for participation in the discourse on sustainable development. Every year at the Commission on Sustainable Development, indigenous peoples are represented there. And their views are valuable and sought. And obviously we can draw much inspiration from indigenous views like the ones that I included in the reflection piece when we got started. The other question, I think there was a question, maybe I'm imagining it, about consumption and sustainable consumption. And I thought I would just throw out that it's interesting that World Watch Institute in its next State of the World report is doing the feature on sustainable consumption, a topic that's very relevant to our discussion this morning. And included in that publication will be a chapter on religion and sustainable consumption. And Gary Gardner, the colleague that I mentioned in my talk, who had written about religion so much, contacted us some months ago about this question and wanted to know what the Baha'i approach was to consumption. And did we have any programs that discouraged consumption? And I had to think about it, but I thought about it and actually gave him back some information about an institution of the faith called hukukala. It's the right of God. Now, this is a very important feature of the Baha'i faith. It's a feature for voluntary giving. It's entirely dependent on the will of the individual. It requires us to distinguish between our needs and our wants, and to give a portion of our excess back to God. And actually, it goes to the institutions of the faith, and it's used for the betterment of humankind in general. Gary said that this was the most profound response that he had heard from a religion to date. Now, this is not a campaign, if you will. This is an institution and a law of the faith. So it's something that each of us, I think, is learning about simply because it was only made applicable across the Baha'i world in 1992, but it has profound implications for the future.
Thank you. We're going to try to fit in 2 more questions. There really were so many excellent questions, and we're having a tough time getting to all of them. But let's ask these last 2, and then maybe if people have questions, we can talk to some of the speakers afterwards. This is a question for Peter Brown. You critique the notion of God creating humankind in his image. The Baha'i view is that all created things reflect divine attributes. Human beings are capable of reflecting all these attributes. Would this conception of image be more in line with the notion of grace and good stewardship that you talked about? And then somebody's asking about the concept of dualism, which you mentioned is partly responsible for our present dilemma. How can we bring in the idea of pluralism and balance that has been lost to the attention of the masses? And then finally, there's a question about climate change. In the US, there's a well-organized movement fueled by right-wing talk radio and certain political organizations attempting to demonstrate that human efforts on climate change are minimal or non-existent. How should we go about addressing these perspectives? So I'll give you a chance to answer those few questions, and then we'll wrap it up for this morning.
Read the first one again and the last one.
Sure. First one and the last one. You critique the notion of God creating humankind in his image. The Baha'i view is that all created things reflect divine attributes. Human beings are capable of reflecting all of these attributes, if they choose so. I think that's what it says. Would this conception of image be more in line with your notion of grace and good stewardship?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll take a stab at it. The reason I use the Henry Beston quote is that there's ideas of multiple perfections in there. I have a friend who's used to teach with me at the University of Maryland. His idea when he was flying somewhere, he'd calculate if the plane door opened and you were sucked out, would you die first from freezing to death or from hitting the ground first? And he thought that was an interesting question to analyze. I actually rather not even know the answer, but it is, just in case you're curious, you freeze to death first, so you hit the ground like a block of ice. So that was his idea, of fun, basically. Well, and he was very good at that kind of question. But owls are very good at seeing mice in the dark, right? And ravens or osprey are very good at seeing fish underwater, right? So cockroaches are very good at hiding in the corner. So there are multiple excellences. I don't see any reason to privilege the excellence that we have. I think we should be respectful and care about the things we're good at. Differential equations, foreign languages, those are things I'm not good at, but I would like to be good at. But there's no reason to say that the excellence of an osprey or the excellence of an owl isn't also an excellency. So I find all the pretenses of the glorious thing is man. I would say the glorious thing is life, right? And various living forms exhibit the perfections that are possible in the universe. And we're not the end. We will go extinct as a species. Will all excellence or the supreme thing in the universe go extinct at that point? Not in my view. Something else will happen. Something else may be happening elsewhere. It's 100 billion planets, 100 billion galaxies, 100 billion planets. Who knows what's happening? So I think that's pretentious, actually, to hold that view. And I don't think it's required by religious faith either. I think you can have faith and confidence in the future without privileging humanity in it.
I'd like to talk about the question about the well-organized movement trying to demonstrate that the human effects of climate change are minimal or non-existent. This really gets my hackles up. If you study the science, friends, it's a no-brainer. And you have the scientists, the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's top scientists have reached consensus with certainty that climate change is happening. Now, the evidence is all there, and it's easy to find. There are some very interesting efforts to kind of debunk the debunkers, if you will. There's a website that has videos, and I'm at a loss. I can't quite remember what it was, but it's video responses to the myths that are being perpetrated by those that are discounting the science. And if you get in touch with me after the conference, I can probably give you the link to that. But I just think the science is so clear, and there's so much evidence. And I have a colleague in the National Council of Churches who runs their eco-justice campaign, and her approach is they don't pay any attention to these people anymore. There's too much work to be done with those that understand and can get going on this issue. Why waste your time, I think, is her sentiment. And then finally, there is a fantastic high school teacher somewhere in the Midwest that has put up a number of very entertaining videos on the web. And his argument basically is we win whether climate change is real or not by converting to a green economy. We get rid of our dependence on fossil fuels. We, we generate all kinds of new business from the new approaches to a green economy. And anyway, if we take no action, we have tremendous risk. If we do take action, and it is a problem, then we've done the right thing. If we take action and it's not a problem, we're still going to come out ahead.
Just following on from Peter's comments on that issue, having worked in the United Nations for many years, struggling with this kind of problem where in the scientific literature, 98% of literature says climate change is happening, if not more. In the popular press, particularly in America, it's 50-50. They're trying to sort of treat the two sides of the argument equally in some way. And of course, then you find that there are vested interests that have a conjugation interest, to try to present disinformation between the oil industry, which wants to preserve the sale of oil and doesn't want the link with climate change, the tobacco industry that sees science as making a link between tobacco and, say, lung cancer, and therefore wants to discredit science for that reason. Some of the fundamentalist, religious groups that think that science, says that evolution has happened when everybody knows the world was created 4,000 years ago, and therefore, and in any case, since Christ is returning soon, you can forget about the earth. The environment doesn't matter because we're all going to be going to heaven. There's a conjugation of interests which has been trying to sell a different message to the American people in particular. You don't see the same thing in other parts of the world, as it is here. So I think all you can do there is to become conscious that there is manipulation going on, try to investigate the truth independently, and look at spiritual responsibilities as a better foundation than necessarily what you're reading in the media every day, to try to counteract the kind of brainwashing going on, particularly within American society, that is not, that you're sort of surrounded by it, drowning in it, and therefore it takes a certain amount of effort to vaccinate yourself against the messages you're being bombarded with that may have no scientific foundation, but have a very strong foundation in vested interest trying to protect their particular perspective. But I think just finally, to close this issue of dualism and how do we bring pluralism and balance, behind that dualism is a strong element of ego, of man sort of saying, we are the top of creation, the environment is something outside of us, we dominate. It's a misinterpretation perhaps of some biblical phrases, or sometimes even a mistranslation. But if we approach this issue with humility, the kinds of spiritual values that the Baha'i teaching are so important, that can help us to stand back from that and recognize that it's on that basis of spiritual values we can find the necessary balance to address these problems and find solutions that meet our needs and the planet's needs together.
Okay, thank you very much. We're just getting, let's give a round of applause. Good idea to our presenters. Dear friends, the House of Justice has talked about 3 areas of work for the Baha'i community. So one of those areas is the expansion and consolidation of the Baha'i community. The second is the work of social action in its larger form, social and economic development projects, in smaller form, small types of community action. And then the third is contributing to the discourses of humanity. And I think what we've done here this morning is to really exercise our faculty of looking at science, looking at academics in this field who have done amazing work, and then looking at the Baha'i writings and what that has to say. And hopefully this will lead us to go back to our communities and engage in some type of action and continue to learn about this. Bring it into our Ruhi study circles, into our work with our neighbors, into our home visits, and think about how we can contribute to the discourses that are taking place at the local level, how we might engage in some type of local action. So I think this is what the organizers of the panel had in mind. I want to thank the IEF and the Association for Baha'i Studies for their hard work in putting together this panel this morning, and again for our guest speakers who did an amazing job.